What if everything we know as the beginning in the Bible isn't really the beginning? What if Genesis 1:1 is actually a fresh start, a second attempt, carefully positioned as the starting point of creation, while an earlier chapter has been completely erased from the narrative? This video will take you through hidden paths, forgotten texts, and mystical traditions that reveal something astonishing. Before "Let there be light," there was a silent decree, a previous chaos, and a plan that failed. Prepare to rediscover the true beginning, the one thing most have never dared to question. Why does the Bible begin with the earth already without form and void? This is one of the first questions that confronts us with a mystery. If God is perfect and his creation is intentional, why is the world described as a place of darkness and disorder in the second verse? Genesis 1:2 does not sound like a pure beginning, but rather like a post-catastrophe scene. Could this be evidence of a previous universe that was undone? And further, why is there such a rush to ignore this gap? Ancient texts indicate that God did not create the world out of nothing, but rather reorganize something that already existed. This concept appears in several ancient Jewish traditions, including the writings of the Talmud and the reflections of Kabbalah. The Hebrew word bara, to create, used in Genesis is also often interpreted as to form from something, not to create from nothing. This opens the door to a bold hypothesis. What was God reorganizing, and what happened to what had come before? This theory has become known as the gap theory, the idea that there is a hidden gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Many theologians and scholars, such as Thomas Chalmers in the 19th century, have proposed that there was a creation before the present one, a creation that was destroyed, judged, and forgotten. The earth was without form and void because it had been devastated by a spiritual event of great proportions. And now, in the apocryphal and mystical texts, clues are beginning to emerge about this first chapter. Chapter 0 of Genesis. Before continuing, we ask that you support our channel by subscribing and leaving a like. This is very important to keep the channel alive. Thank you. What happened in this Genesis 0 that led God to restart creation? Among the possible answers, one stands out in the oldest traditions. There was a rebellion, a conflict between spiritual beings even before the creation of visible matter. Some texts suggest that an angelic hierarchy failed to fulfill the original divine order, and the result was the collapse of a previous reality, a reality that God erased with a new command: let there be light. The chaos described in Genesis 1:2 may be the aftermath of this earlier judgment. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. It does not seem to describe a newly constructed structure, but rather something devastated. The waters of the deep, or Tehom in Hebrew, are linked to primordial, often chaotic forces, similar to those described in the Enuma Elish, an ancient Babylonian creation myth. Are we witnessing echoes of a veiled destruction? And then something begins to hover over this abyss, the Spirit of God. The verse continues, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. This is a powerful image. It is not a spirit creating, but restoring, preparing the ground for a new beginning. This action supports the idea that what we see in Genesis 1:3 and onward is a rebuilding, a second chance for creation. But what came before that? And who was involved? Apocryphal and Gnostic texts provide clues to this forgotten past. The Book of Enoch, for example, speaks of a previous heavenly order where angels fell before man was created. The Apocalypse of Moses mentions a divine council where decisions were made before the formation of Eden, and the Gospel of Truth, considered heretical by the councils, describes a fall in the spiritual world that required creative intervention. These accounts point to a history before history. At the heart of this theory is the concept of a divine council that predated the creation of man. Psalm 82 mentions that God stands in the assembly of the mighty, he judges in the midst of the gods. This passage is often ignored or reinterpreted, but many scholars connect it to a real heavenly assembly that existed before humanity. These Elohim were supposedly elevated spiritual beings with responsibilities and freedom, but who eventually failed. This would have required a new creation, this time with man as the protagonist. The Hebrew text of Genesis 1:1 also carries hidden secrets. The word Bereshit, often translated as "in the beginning," can have multiple interpretations in ancient Hebrew. Some scholars of Gematria and Kabbalah suggest that this word contains a code indicating that something came before. An alternative reading is, "In the beginning God created," indicating that the beginning itself is a subsequent agent or step after an earlier decision. Are we reading the second chapter without having seen the first? The Kabbalistic tradition speaks of Adam Kadmon, the primordial man who preceded Adam. According to these mystical teachings, before the physical creation of man, God designed an archetypal, spiritual being who contained all the essence of humanity. This Adam Kadmon would have been the first attempt to express the image and likeness of God, but something in this plan did not go as it should have. He was hidden, and a new man was created, Adam. This would explain why the creation of man in Genesis seems abrupt. It would have been a substitution. This idea also appears in Gnostic texts, such as the Apocryphon of John. There, an inferior divine being tries to create man in his own image, resulting in an incomplete being. Then the supreme God sends his light to correct this failure. Although Gnostic content should be approached with discernment, it echoes something important: creation was corrected. This reinforces the thesis that there was a chapter 0 where something was misinterpreted, corrupted, or destroyed, and the Bible begins its narrative with the corrected version already in progress. If Genesis 1 is a reconstruction, then Eden was not the first garden either. That changes everything. Some mystical schools believe that the Garden of Eden was a replica, an attempt to restore an earlier paradise that had been corrupted. This idea appears in fragments of the Book of Jubilees, where it is said that a sacred place existed before Eden, which was removed from the visible earth after the fall of spiritual beings. The Eden we know would therefore be a second chance for communion between God and his creatures. The creation of light in Genesis 1:3 also raises important questions. God said, "Let there be light," but the luminaries, the sun and moon, were not created until the fourth day. So what was this light? Many scholars argue that it was a spiritual light prior to physical light. In ancient Jewish texts such as the Zohar, this light is referred to as Or Haganuz, the hidden light reserved for the righteous at the end of time. This would indicate that the beginning of visible creation was preceded by a spiritual dimension that already existed. Jeremiah 4:23-26 offers a chilling vision, a devastated earth before man. "I looked at the earth, and behold, it was formless and empty, and toward the heavens there was no light." The vocabulary used is the same as in Genesis 1:2, tohu vavohu. But here the context is one of judgment and destruction. The prophet describes a desolate scene, without cities, without man, where even the birds of the air have fled. This could be a prophetic glimpse of what was left of the previous creation, wiped out before the new beginning described in the Torah. There is a continuous line of texts and symbols that point to a universe before our own. From the primordial chaos mentioned in Mesopotamian myths to apocryphal accounts and secret rabbinical teachings, we see a common idea: the present world was not the first. This does not deny the Bible. On the contrary, it deepens its mystery. By recognizing these layers, we understand that the creation we know is part of a larger narrative, carefully condensed in Genesis to protect truths that we are only now beginning to rediscover. The question that resonates is, why were these truths hidden? If there are such clear clues in the ancient texts, why is this information not found in the traditional biblical canon? The answer may lie in the spiritual protection of the divine plan itself. As Deuteronomy 29:29 says, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong to us." The hiding may have been necessary until the right time for discernment arrived, when the people were ready to understand. The formation of the biblical canon was a selective and, in many cases, political process. In the 4th century, councils such as Nicaea and Laodicea defined which books would be considered inspired and which would be rejected. Many writings that dealt with these mysteries were labeled as heretical or too symbolic for the understanding of the time. Texts such as the Book of Enoch, widely accepted by Jews before Christ, have been excluded from most modern versions of the Bible. But even within the Bible, echoes of Genesis and Job are still present. In Job 38, God asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" indicating that there were witnesses to creation, even before humanity. In Proverbs 8, wisdom speaks as an entity present before the beginning. These passages suggest that there was an order prior to the visible creation, a spiritual reality that was disrupted and required a new foundation. Perhaps the real reason for "let there be light." The Spirit hovering over the waters thus becomes a symbol of divine mercy. If there was destruction before the present creation, it is telling that God did not completely abandon the chaos. The Spirit hovering over the waters represents hope, restoration, and intention. This reinforces the idea that the Genesis narrative does not begin in chaos by accident, but rather as part of a transition between what was and what would be, between Genesis erased and Genesis revealed. The reconstruction described in Genesis follows a precise order, almost like a ritual of restoration. First comes the light, but not the light of the sun. Then comes the separation of the waters from the firmament, the organization of the earth. And only then the luminaries, the living beings, and finally, man. Everything indicates that this sequence is not creating from scratch, but rather putting order into something that was already in ruins. This raises the possibility that Adam was not just the first man, but the first man of a second era. The absence of any mention of angels being created in Genesis is also telling. These beings simply already exist. They appear at critical moments with authority and purpose, but the Bible never describes when or how they were created. This reinforces the idea that the spiritual world precedes the physical creation, and that these beings were present at a time before let there be light. Perhaps they were even part of what led to the need for a new beginning. Some Jewish traditions believe that God created and destroyed several worlds before ours. This view, mentioned in the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, says that God created worlds and destroyed them until he created this one. The full sentence reads, "This creation pleased him, but the previous ones did not." This supports the idea that the present Genesis is a filtered result of a much longer history, where failure and judgment had already occurred before human history even began. This notion completely changes the way we view Eden, the fall, and original sin. If man emerged into a restored creation, he did not enter a pristine world, but a spiritual battlefield. Eden, then, would not be a pristine paradise, but a sanctuary surrounded by reminders of a previous rebellion. This would explain why the serpent was already there, active and cunning, and why the path to the tree of life was guarded from the beginning. Something had gone wrong before. The presence of the serpent in Eden is one of the greatest indications of a previous conflict. It appears in the text as a being endowed with cunning, knowledge, and deceitful intentions. But where did it come from? When was it created? Genesis does not answer. The narrative simply positions it as part of the scenery, as if it had already been there before the arrival of man. This reinforces the idea that Eden was built in the aftermath of an older spiritual drama where evil had already been sown. Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 also provide intriguing details about this forgotten past. These texts describe the fall of an exalted being who was in Eden, covered in precious stones, but who became corrupt because of pride. Although many associate this figure with Satan, there are scholars who believe that these passages point to a lineage of beings who inhabited Eden before Adam. This connects directly with the thesis that Eden was a reused stage, part of a plan of redemption and not just of origin. Adam's role may have been more than simply that of the first man. He may have been God's answer to an earlier failure. Created in the image and likeness of the Creator, but with free will, Adam would have been given a second chance to do what the spirit beings had failed to do. This would explain why God walks with him in the garden, why there is such close surveillance, and also why Adam's fall had such cosmic consequences. He carried on a legacy that went back further. With this, the fall ceases to be merely a human error. It becomes the repetition of an ancient pattern. The disobedience in Eden echoes the earlier rebellion that had occurred in heaven. The temptation, the pride, the attempt to be like God. All of these had happened before, to other beings, at another time. Adam relives this cycle, and with it, the earth becomes the new battlefield between light and darkness. But now, with a new element, the promise of future redemption. By understanding this prior reality, the plan of salvation becomes even more profound. Christ, called the second Adam by Paul in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, does not simply correct Adam's error. He repairs the damage of previous ages. The sacrifice on the cross does not just address human sin, but restores a balance that was broken before the foundation of the world. In fact, this expression appears several times in Scripture, suggesting that the plan of redemption existed before the visible creation. Ephesians 1:4 says that we were chosen before the foundation of the world. But which world? The present one? Or the one that existed before let there be light? This early choice shows that God had already prepared a way of reconciliation for something he knew would happen. This strengthens the case that the biblical narrative is a divine response to an earlier fall, an attempt to restore not just humanity, but the entire cosmos. Revelation 13:8 states that the Lamb was slain from the foundation of the world. If Christ's crucifixion was already determined before visible creation, this implies that the problem to be solved predated human creation. The cross then becomes the answer to an older, deeper evil, one that began in Genesis 0. This line of thinking gives new meaning to God's plan. He is not just starting something new, but repairing something old. This revelation brings us to a spiritual turning point. Everything that exists has a greater purpose. Creation, the fall, redemption. These are not isolated events. They are part of a larger story that began before recorded history. A silent spiritual war shaped the landscape in which we live today. And as we learn about what existed before Genesis, we come to better understand why we are here and where God is taking us. The Bible never denied the existence of hidden mysteries, it simply kept them secret. Proverbs 25:2 declares, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter." This shows us that there are truths hidden between the lines of Scripture, waiting for those who seek them with reverence and discernment. Genesis 0 may not be explicitly stated in the biblical text, but its traces are scattered throughout Revelation like divine footprints in the midst of chaos. Understanding this forgotten chapter radically changes our perception of human purpose. We are not an isolated experiment, nor the first project of creation. We are the response to a previous failure, a new attempt to express the image of God, now with redemption already included in the plan. This places us in a sacred but also responsible position. We have been called to restore something that was lost long before us, and this responsibility gives meaning to every spiritual journey. This understanding also reveals why so many spiritual forces have been working against man from the beginning. The hostility of darkness toward humanity is deep-rooted. We are not just creatures of clay. We are heirs to a divine plan that came to replace that which was broken. And this arouses the wrath of those who failed in the beginning. Man was placed as a witness and repairer of a former kingdom. Hence the attack is constant, and the battle is invisible but real. In the end, Genesis 1 is not the beginning. It is the rebirth. The creation we know is the second act of a much older play. The first act is hidden, fragmented in traditions, revealed in forgotten symbols and prophecies. But as we discover what came before the beginning, we gain new insight into everything that came after. And so we understand, we are not alone in history. We are continuing something that began before time. From this perspective, the Bible becomes even more alive and mysterious. Each verse begins to carry hidden layers, echoes of events that preceded time and space. Understanding Genesis 0 is not about creating a new doctrine, but about recovering a buried truth hidden between the lines, preserved in rejected texts, and kept alive by traditions that have never been silent. It is as if Scripture itself were whispering, "There is more than what you have been told." This forgotten chapter changes our position in creation. We are not just creatures of the beginning. We are the result of a divine decision made after something went wrong. This places us as part of a mission of restoration. Man was created not just to dominate the earth, but to testify that obedience is still possible, that love can overcome pride, and that good can redeem chaos. The existence of a previous world also explains many biblical silences. Why are certain themes only hinted at? Why are there so many references to what the ancients knew without further explanation? Perhaps because that knowledge was reserved for a time of revelation, a time like this. The information age is also the age of the restoration of understanding, and those who seek with discernment receive light. Genesis 0 is an invitation to intimacy with God through mystery. It calls us to look beyond the words and see the heart of the Creator, who, even after the failure of a previous creation, chose to try again, with love, with hope, and with a perfect plan that included the cross from before time. This is the greatness of our God. He begins again when all seems lost, and invites us to be part of the eternal restoration. It all begins to make more sense when we understand that the visible creation is only the surface. Behind the order and beauty we see, there are spiritual scars. Scars of invisible battles, of ancient judgments and divine decisions that cannot be expressed in human words. The Genesis we read is the curtain that opened after a forgotten prologue, a prologue full of glory, fall, and new beginnings. And we are part of this new act, whether we realize it or not. The revelation of Genesis 0 is not meant to generate fear, but to awaken purpose. When we know that the world we live in was built on spiritual ruins, we begin to value every decision, every attitude, every act of faith. We are witnesses to an eternal story, and each of us plays a role in this narrative. God has entrusted us with a mission to continue where others have failed, and this requires awareness, discernment, and total commitment. This understanding prepares us for the end, because those who understand the beginning will be ready for the end. Revelation will not be a shock to those who have already understood the mystery of creation. Everything is connected, from Genesis erased to Revelation revealed. And those who embrace this truth walk with firm steps, knowing that eternity did not begin in Genesis 1:1. It began much earlier in the heart of God. Phrase of the day: before he said, "Let there be light," God had already decided to love you, and that changes everything. And if this truth burns in your heart, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. And now we have a members area. By becoming a member, you bless this work and help us to continue producing edifying and revealing content like this. Just click on the Become a Member button below next to the Subscribe button. Be a part of this, and tell me, which city are you watching from?